Hi, Tricia here. In this video, we're just going to have a quick look at different types of watercolour washes. So it's going to be a really simple, easy technique for you to try. Looking at those essential skills, we're going to look at a couple of different washes. We're going to try some dry brush. We're going to have a little bit of salt. We're going to look at the way that our brushes work and a little bit of negative painting. So let's get ourselves started. Okay, I'm going to work through some washes here, and this is a flat wash. So I'm just going over with my brush, trying to keep my movements quite quick so that I don't get streaks and things drying on my paper. And this is just a flat colour. Right, this next one is a graded wash. And so I'm putting the colour at the top here. Putting a few strokes of colour at the top. I'm dipping into my water and I'm adding some water at the bottom. Can you see? So it's bleeding out, going into my water again and adding some clear water right at the bottom there. And that's allowing the colour to bleed out and create this graded effect of tones. I'm going to do several different techniques here. So I'm going to pop in just some plain flat washes again to work on. There we go. And I'm going to work over the top of these. So you'll see as I go through this little project, each different layer. Okay, so the paper that I'm working on here is a watercolour paper. It's a gummed block, which means that all the way around the outside there's glue holding it down. This is really nice to work on just for quick sort of exercises and things. You haven't got to stretch your paper. Not that I stretch paper very often now, but you haven't got to do anything like that with it. It's a 300 GSM paper, so it's a nice thick paper. And the brush that I'm using is a synthetic brush. It's just a round brush, but this is a synthetic brush, and I think it's a number 8. Okay, so I'm just putting water down here. So I'm going to do a wet on wet wash. I'm going to pick up 2 colours. So down the left hand side here, I'm adding this this pinky cerise colour, and that's bleeding into the water that I've put down. And then on this side I'm adding a blue, I think it's like a cerulean I've put on here, and I'm going to put this on the right hand side, and I'm just going to let those bleed across. So as the project goes on, you'll see those moving together. We'll see if I've put enough paint on for them to actually touch each other. But yeah, if you put a lot of paint in, it will spread as far as it can through any damp paper or any water that's on there. Okay, let's write on here what we've got. So we've got a flat wash here, and we've got a graded wash, yeah. Wet on wet here. If I don't keep a track of it, I might forget what I've done on each bit. So okay, so I'm going to work wet on wet again here. So, but rather than a clear water going down first, like I did on the one just, I'm going to put a colour down. So I'm going to put a nice block of this cerise colour down, and then we're going to work paint into it. This is a nice deep blue colour. I think like an indigo it might be. It's a really deep blue that I'm popping into it. Or maybe like a Prussian blue. So this is different here. I've just dotted the tip of the brush onto the wet layer underneath, and you'll just see how the paint sort of spreads. It doesn't stay still, but because I'm not pushing it around very much, you know, it's not mixing with the colour underneath, it's just spreading through it. Okay, so I'm going to dry brush. So I loaded my brush with paint and then I wiped a lot of it off onto the tissue there. And can you see? So my brush has got paint in it, but it's quite dry. It's not wet to touch the brush. And what's happening there is the surface of the paper, my paint is just catching on those ridges on the surface of the paper. So I've got these sort of white bits coming through. Okay, so here I'm just sort of scrubbing, I suppose you could call it scumbling, and I'm putting this cerise in and I'm just sort of scrubbing backwards and forwards with my round brush. Now I'm going to take that blue, and I'm going to add that in, and I'm just sort of scrubbing this into it, pressing down with the tip of my brush. So I'm kind of getting a mixture of different colours here. It's wet on wet because I'm pushing the two together, but I'm also mixing them as I'm pressing. But I've got some areas where, you know, the original colour is still there. I'm going to put some colour down here. It's going all nice and sunny now. Here we go, put some colour down the bottom. I've dried my brush off now on the tissue, and now I'm pulling it up from that kind of well of paint that was sitting at the bottom there. So I'm dragging it out. I'm also, because I'm pulling it on drier through the paper, I'm getting some pull marks in the paint as well. So I can create some little textures there. Okay, so now, excuse me, this top box now is dry. So I've just wet my brush with some clear water, nice clean water, and I'm just rubbing my damp brush onto the surface, and then I'm washing my brush off, and now I'm using a tissue, there we go, and I'm lifting the paint out. So I can lift out dry paint. Now, depending on how staining your paint is, you'll get some colour staying in your paper. You won't lift it all out. Some colours will really lift out well, and others will really stain your paper. This one has still left a little hint, so I'm not going back to the pure white of the paper. I have got a tiny bit of colour there. Okay, so let's do some marks, some little details. What can my brush do? So I'll press on the belly of the brush. Oops. Uh-oh. Try and dab that off. Okay, I'll incorporate this in. I'm pressing the tip of the brush and the belly down, and I'm pulling it up onto the very tip of the brush there. So I get these little teardrops coming out. Press and twist and pull. So have a little play about with your different brushes and what happens when you push down with more of the brush and right onto the belly, and what happens when you pull up right onto the tiny tip. I've got quite a round tip on this brush, so let's see. Look, here's my tip. So I haven't got a very fine line here because my tip is quite rounded, but if you've got one that comes into a very fine point, you might be able to get super fine lines. I will call this details. Maybe I should have called it mark making, actually. I don't think I'd have fitted that in that space, but yeah. Okay, so up here I'm going to paint a really hard edge. So can you see I'm stopping my paint, I'm painting on dry paper. So I've got dry paper here and I'm painting in nice strong colour, and it's giving me a really crisp hard edge there to what I'm painting. So across the bottom here, a nice hard edge. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit of a watery colour and I'm going to add that onto the edge and see how I can soften that edge now and let it bleed out so it's not that crisp straight line, it's a nice soft edge. I can pull this softer edge out a bit more. There's a lot of paint here so it's moving in it, but I can soften those edges by dampening them and letting them bleed out slightly. Very similar to what we did at the top with the graded wash, but this time we're just looking at the edges that we're producing. I can work into this dampness here. And you see the paint that I'm adding onto that damp paint now, it's moving, it's not sitting as a solid block, so it's just flowing into that paint that I've added. So the difference between a hard edge working on dry paper and a soft edge where you're sort of dampening those edges or working into damp paper. Okay, I've got this nice dark colour here, so I'm going to do a little effect here, which is quite nice. So I've got a nice strong colour on here, and then into this I'm going to drop some salt. Make sure I've got a lot of colour on there. And here we go, sprinkle the salt in. You can already see what's happening. The salt is sucking the moisture in the paint, the water, and it's sucking it into it. Look how the colour's changing already. And then around those little grains of salt, it's going to suck more and more and more colour into itself. You can do this with all different types of salt, table salt, sea salt, rock salt, all sorts of stuff. All right. Let's give ourselves another little background here. There we go. Salt, this one is. We'll leave that little green one to dry a minute. Trying to get all my colours sorted out and prepared. Okay, let's glaze over the top of this one, this purple block that we've got sitting here. So what we're looking at is what happens when we put a different colour on top. Our watercolours are translucent, that's what makes them special. So they're see-through. So when I paint over the top, the colour underneath won't disappear. It will come through. So it will change the colour of what I've put on top. So I've put this sort of reddy orange on top, and you can see that where it's gone over the purple, I get this much deeper colour. So this is called glazing, and I can layer up colours on top of each other to create, you know, third colours. Between the two of them, I've got a third colour now. So this is quite good fun to play with, and it's really good for things like shadows. So you can use glazing to build up shadows on different things. Oh, talking of shadows, look what's happened. The sun's got in. Oh my goodness. Okay, so the last one here is some negative space. So with my negative space, what I'm doing is I'm painting around what I want to leave. So I want trees on here. So I've got this green background. So what I'm doing is I'm painting the sky that I can see around the trees. This sort of makes sense. So I'm not painting the tree shapes in, I'm not painting green trees in, I'm painting all this dark sky around and leaving the tree shapes as a kind of silhouette. This is a really useful technique to look at the negative shapes. Another great one when you're working on shadows, to put shadows in, and it gives you a really nice effect. Negative space. So there we go. I hope you have fun with this project, and I'd love to see what you do. If you want to do more watercolours, then check out my website where I've got an online course just right for beginners. Don't forget, visit my website for your art resources, follow me on social media, like this video and subscribe to my channel.